Evangelical Christian End Times Threat. There is a clear and distinct end times narrative that interprets modern geopolitical events as signs of imminent prophetic fulfillment. Here are some specific shared themes. Prophetic interpretation of current events. There are perceived connections between contemporary events and biblical prophecy, asserting that recent developments signal the approach of the end times or the second coming of Jesus. This perspective sees historical and political events as more than coincidental or human-made. Instead, they are portrayed as orchestrated milestones in a divine plan. Focus on Israel and the Temple Mount. Both messages emphasize Israel and, specifically, the Temple Mount, as central to fulfilling prophecy. The Temple Mount, as a historically and religiously significant site, is presented as a focal point where supernatural events are expected to unfold. The frequent mention of the Third Temple's construction, access by religious leaders, and ceremonial acts on the Temple Mount are framed as concrete steps toward these predictions. Religious artifacts as sources of power. Both transcripts highlight religious artifacts, the Ark of the Covenant in the second and the Messianic expectations in the first, as having literal or symbolic power. There's a sense that these artifacts or expectations are not just religious symbols but could play active roles in military or spiritual warfare, reinforcing a belief in their supernatural influence on physical events. Division between righteous and others. Each message conveys a division between those who support or bless the Jewish people, or align with prophetic beliefs, and those who oppose them, with blessings or judgments predicted accordingly. This creates an in-group of believers who are expected to be rewarded and an out-group who are either ignorant or at risk of divine retribution. This framework can amplify a sense of exclusivity and urgency for those who believe they must choose a side. Fear and urgency to influence behavior. Both speakers use an urgent, sometimes fear-inducing tone to motivate listeners to align themselves with their religious message. Prepare for the impending messianic event. Or repent. The expectation of imminent, unavoidable divine intervention is portrayed as a reason to act quickly, lest one be left behind or found wanting in the face of judgment. Passive hope in divine intervention over active solutions. Both messages encourage a perspective that world problems, such as conflict, suffering, or spiritual decline, will ultimately be resolved by divine intervention rather than human action. This expectation may discourage followers from engaging in proactive solutions or cooperative efforts, leading them to focus on spiritual preparation instead. Reinforcement of a specific religious identity. Each transcript emphasizes that true understanding of these events is accessible only through a particular religious lens, Jewish prophecy in the first, Christian prophecy in the second. This restricts the interpretation of global events to specific religious narratives, which could limit open discourse with other groups or discourage broader, inclusive dialogue on these issues. This reflects a religious framework that interprets modern events through the lens of ancient prophecies and presents an end-times worldview. This perspective prioritizes spiritual alignment and prophecy fulfillment, emphasizing Israel's role, viewing certain artifacts as powerful, and urging listeners to prepare for imminent divine action. In a secular context, these shared elements can be seen as fostering exclusivity, passivity toward world issues, and a heightened sense of urgency for believers. If the goals outlined in the end times narratives were pursued to their perceived completion, several significant outcomes could unfold, both within communities holding these beliefs and in broader geopolitical contexts. Here are some potential consequences. Heightened religious and political tensions in the Middle East. The construction of a third temple on the Temple Mount would be a monumental religious and political action, but also a flashpoint for tension, given the Temple Mount's importance to both Jews and Muslims. Any attempt to alter its current status could provoke protests, conflict, or even broader violence. This action might intensify hostilities between Israel and neighboring countries, further complicating peace efforts in the region. Increased polarization and division, emphasizing that believers are on a divine path while others are not, can create deep divides, not only across religious lines but also within communities and nations. As a result, polarization might worsen, with adherents viewing those outside the faith or who oppose these goals as morally or spiritually deficient. Such attitudes could strain interfaith relations and lead to social fragmentation, reducing opportunities for cooperation on shared concerns. Passive attitudes toward global problems, relying on divine intervention for solutions to poverty, conflict, and other societal issues might result in less human-driven problem-solving. Believers may adopt a more passive approach, thinking that human efforts are either futile or unnecessary. This could slow progress on critical issues like climate change, poverty alleviation, and social justice, as followers focus instead on spiritual preparation for end times rather than tangible solutions. The rise of extremist or radicalized groups. Narratives that frame certain groups as chosen and others as opposing divine can potentially radicalize individuals or inspire extremist actions. Some followers, especially if they feel divinely justified, might take it upon themselves to accelerate prophetic events. This could lead to isolated acts of violence or organized campaigns that seek to bring about prophecy, which may destabilize societies and increase security risks. Global impact on diplomacy and foreign relations. If certain nations adopt policies influenced by end-times prophecy narratives, this could shift diplomatic priorities and complicate international relations. For example, an American administration with strong ties to end-times beliefs might prioritize actions that support Israel regardless of broader geopolitical considerations, which could strain alliances, create friction with Muslim-majority nations, or impact negotiations in international bodies like the UN. Economic implications of escalating conflict. Intensified conflict around the Temple Mount or broader Middle Eastern tensions could destabilize economies, particularly through disruptions to trade and energy supplies. Oil prices, for example, could spike if instability in the region leads to embargoes or restrictions on exports. Increased defense spending or a refugee crisis might also strain national budgets and resources in affected areas. Social and psychological effects on followers. The belief in an imminent end times can lead to significant psychological effects. Followers may experience anxiety, fear, or a sense of alienation from broader society, which might disrupt their mental well-being or personal relationships. Some may even adopt a fatalistic outlook, feeling disillusioned with everyday goals and investments in society, education, or career development. Potential for missed opportunities in science and education. A strong focus on divine intervention over human-driven solutions could deprioritize science, technology, and education, especially fields seen as unnecessary or misaligned with end-times thinking. This could hamper advancements in public health, environmental science, and other critical areas, delaying progress and leaving future generations with greater challenges. reduced global cooperation. Emphasis on a singular religious narrative might hinder global cooperation on universal issues like climate change, public health, and peace building. Dividing the world into righteous and others reduces the motivation to collaborate across cultural and religious lines, making it harder to find common ground on shared global challenges. While these beliefs can provide a sense of community and purpose for followers, pursuing end times goals to completion could lead to increased regional conflict, global instability, social division, and passivity toward practical solutions. A balanced approach that respects religious beliefs while promoting human-driven progress and peace-building would better serve the collective needs of a diverse and interconnected world. The pursuit of end times goals could indeed increase the likelihood of conflict, especially in the Middle East, but potentially on a global scale. Here's how these beliefs could intersect with the possibility of war. Escalation of tensions over the Temple Mount and Third Temple construction. The Temple Mount holds profound significance for both Jewish and Muslim communities. Any attempt to alter the current arrangements, such as constructing a third temple, would likely provoke fierce opposition from the Muslim world, particularly from Palestinians and neighboring countries. If construction were to proceed, this could trigger violent clashes, civil unrest, or even military responses from regional actors who see this as a violation of their religious rights. Proxy conflicts and regional alliances. Many Middle Eastern countries align along religious and political lines, often with backing from global powers. If conflict arises over the Temple Mount or Israel's religious actions, it could draw in other regional powers, like Iran, which has historically supported Palestinian groups. This could lead to proxy conflicts or even direct military interventions, heightening instability in the region and increasing the chances of broader, drawn-out warfare. Encouragement of extremist militias and terrorist activities. A focus on end times prophecy may embolden extremist groups that believe they are fighting a holy war. Such groups could use prophetic narratives as justification for acts of terrorism, viewing violence as a divinely sanctioned means to accelerate prophecy. This could lead to an increase in attacks, both in the Middle East and potentially abroad, as extremists attempt to create or amplify conflict in alignment with end times beliefs. Military posturing by major powers. Global powers with vested interests in the Middle East, such as the United States, Russia, and China, might be drawn into the conflict, either to support allies or protect economic interests like oil supplies. Increased military posturing or direct intervention by these powers would add layers of complexity, with the risk of miscalculations leading to escalation. A larger-scale war could emerge if tensions spiral, as competing nations seek to protect their interests or allies in the region. Nuclear threats and heightened risks. The Middle East contains nuclear-capable states, and a severe escalation over Jerusalem or the Temple Mount could raise concerns over nuclear threats, especially if actors feel cornered or existentially threatened. Israel's nuclear capabilities, alongside Iran's contested nuclear program, create a dangerous backdrop where a regional war could carry the risk of nuclear escalation, either as a last resort or as a deterrent in a highly volatile situation. Global religious tensions and domestic unrest. In nations with diverse religious communities, rising tensions over Israel's actions or the Temple Mount could spark domestic unrest. This could manifest as protests, hate crimes, or even civil disturbances, as communities react to perceived threats or mistreatment of their religious heritage. In Western countries with significant Christian, Jewish, and Muslim populations, the issue could strain social cohesion and lead to outbreaks of violence. Expansion of conflict to global economic and strategic resources. Should a conflict over Israel or the Temple Mount escalate, it would likely impact global energy supplies and trade routes. Strained energy resources could lead to economic hardships globally, which in turn might prompt further unrest or pressure governments to take aggressive actions. This scenario could broaden the scope of the conflict, drawing in more countries beyond the immediate region. Justification of preemptive or defensive wars. Prophetic beliefs can sometimes lead to the perception that war is inevitable or even desirable to fulfill prophecy. If actors on any side believe they are called to bring about specific events, they may feel justified in launching preemptive strikes or engaging in risky military operations, believing that such actions are divinely sanctioned. This mentality could significantly lower the threshold for war, as actions normally deemed too dangerous or provocative might be seen as necessary steps in a larger divine plan. Possibility of world war. In a worst-case scenario, if conflicts over religious sites in Israel were to pull in the US, Russia, China, and other nations, a regional conflict could escalate into a global war. Given these nations' alliances and economic interdependencies, the conflict could spill over into other regions and prompt a world war with severe humanitarian, environmental, and economic consequences. The pursuit of end-times prophecy goals, especially around the highly contested Temple Mount, creates a risk for conflict escalation on multiple levels, ranging from regional wars to global confrontations. A religiously motivated conflict over Jerusalem could easily entangle numerous countries, leading to a large-scale, potentially catastrophic war. From a secular perspective, maintaining peace in the region would require prioritizing diplomatic channels, respecting all religious perspectives, and promoting conflict resolution that avoids triggering prophecy-driven militarization. Global thermonuclear war is fine with the evangelicals. They believe there will be a new earth. They will live on the new earth while everyone else suffers in hell forever. Certain interpretations of evangelical end-times theology do include an expectation of a new earth, where believers are saved and live in a redeemed world, while others face eternal suffering. This belief can affect attitudes toward global catastrophe, as some see such destruction as an unavoidable or even necessary step toward divine fulfillment. For those who hold this view, events like a global conflict or nuclear war might be seen less as tragedies to be avoided and more as the means by which their vision of ultimate salvation and judgment is realized. This perspective raises several issues and risks. Complacency toward global catastrophe. If a significant number of people believe that catastrophic events are part of a divine plan leading to a better future for the faithful, this can create a complacency or even passive acceptance of potential disasters. For example, concerns over climate change, nuclear disarmament, and international diplomacy may be deprioritized, with some feeling that human efforts are ultimately futile or irrelevant in the face of divine will. Potential encouragement of escalation. In extreme cases, individuals or groups holding such beliefs might even support policies or actions that increase the likelihood of conflict. When leaders and policymakers are influenced by these apocalyptic interpretations, they may be more willing to endorse or overlook militaristic approaches, even at the risk of severe global consequences, as they view these events as heralding their own salvation. Polarization and devaluation of others. The belief in a new earth for the faithful and eternal punishment for non-believers can deepen divisions between groups. This viewpoint can lead to the dehumanization or dismissal of those outside the faith, which complicates cooperation on global challenges that affect everyone. If non-believers are viewed as ultimately doomed or less worthy, there's less incentive to prioritize peace, humanitarian work, or inclusive dialogue. Reduced emphasis on preventive measures for those who see the current Earth as transient or destined for destruction. The importance of long-term solutions for world peace, environmental protection, and social justice may seem less pressing. This outlook could lead to diminished support for policies or initiatives that seek to address or prevent global crises, as these issues might be perceived as inconsequential in the larger prophetic picture. Moral hazard of divine immunity. Some believers may feel they are divinely protected or chosen, and therefore insulated from the consequences of global destruction, including nuclear war. This belief in divine immunity can make the idea of massive conflict or catastrophe seem less alarming, as they trust that they and their communities will be spared. This attitude could lead to a dangerous disregard for the real, immediate consequences of global conflict. Erosion of collective responsibility. Viewing the world through a lens where only the faithful are redeemed can erode a sense of shared humanity and collective responsibility. Secular approaches that emphasize the intrinsic value of human life, global solidarity, and ethical stewardship might be dismissed as secondary concerns, overshadowed by the ultimate goal of spiritual redemption. This erosion of collective responsibility risks undermining the very fabric of cooperative society. Impact on policy and governance. When leaders or influential figures adopt apocalyptic beliefs, this can affect policies on foreign affairs, environmental protection, and nuclear arms control. If policymakers see no value in preserving the current world because of their beliefs in a new, divinely created Earth, they may disregard critical steps to ensure safety and stability. This attitude can make governance more volatile and increase the risks of destructive policy decisions. While apocalyptic beliefs about a new Earth and eternal judgment might provide comfort or purpose for some, they can lead to dangerous complacency toward, or even support for, global destruction. A belief system that views catastrophic events as necessary or desirable can create moral hazards, reduce cooperation on global issues, and foster divisions that increase the likelihood of conflict. From a secular perspective, fostering a shared commitment to protecting and improving this world can help counteract these risks and promote stability, peace, and mutual respect across diverse beliefs. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 was widely seen as a significant victory for evangelical Christians. Many evangelical leaders and voters supported him, seeing his policies as aligned with their social, religious, and political priorities. Key factors in this support included Supreme Court and judicial appointments. Evangelicals placed a strong emphasis on judicial appointments, particularly with respect to the Supreme Court, as they saw this as an opportunity to influence key issues such as abortion, religious freedoms, and LGBTQ+ rights. Trump's promise to appoint conservative judges played a major role in securing evangelical support, which was later fulfilled with appointments that aligned with their beliefs. Religious freedom initiatives. Many evangelicals felt that their religious freedoms were under threat, especially in cases involving businesses or institutions refusing services that conflicted with their beliefs. Trump's administration supported policies they believed would protect religious freedom, giving evangelicals confidence in his commitment to their priorities. Stance on Israel. Evangelicals widely supported Trump's pro-Israel stance, including his decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. Many evangelical Christians believe in a religious connection to Israel, seeing it as prophetically significant, which bolstered their alignment with Trump's foreign policy, opposition to secularism and moral decline. Trump's opposition to certain liberal social policies and his rhetoric on issues they saw as tied to moral decline resonated with evangelical groups. They believed his leadership would counteract the secularization of American culture and reinforce conservative religious values in public life. Protection of traditional values. Many evangelicals were attracted to Trump's policies on issues like abortion and LGBTQ+ rights, where they saw him as more aligned with the traditionalist stances than other recent Republican candidates. While Trump's lifestyle and rhetoric were sometimes at odds with evangelical ideals, many saw him as a means to protect and promote their values through policy, and they interpreted his presidency as a way to secure what they viewed as essential to the moral and spiritual health of the nation. Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 presidential election is widely regarded as a significant triumph for evangelical Christians. White evangelical voters, who have consistently supported Trump in previous elections, maintained their strong backing in 2024, with approximately 80% casting their votes for him. This unwavering support stems from Trump's alignment with key evangelical priorities, including opposition to abortion, advocacy for religious freedom, and the appointment of conservative judges. Evangelical leaders have praised Trump's policies on immigration, the economy, and Christian rights, viewing his presidency as a defense of their values. Additionally, Trump's re-election has been interpreted by some evangelical communities as a divine intervention. At the Republican National Convention, Trump attributed his survival of an assassination attempt to an act of God, resonating with many evangelicals who believe his presidency is part of a divine plan. Overall, Trump's 2024 election victory is seen as a reaffirmation of evangelical influence in American politics. The evangelicals also believe Trump will help them to build their third temple. The concept of the Third Temple holds significant importance in both Jewish and Christian eschatology. In Jewish tradition, the Third Temple is anticipated as a future holy sanctuary in Jerusalem, succeeding Solomon's Temple and the Second Temple, both of which were destroyed in ancient times. Its construction is associated with the coming of the Messiah and the restoration of divine worship among some evangelical Christians. The rebuilding of the Third Temple is viewed as a precursor to the second coming of Jesus Christ. This belief is rooted in interpretations of biblical prophecies that suggest the establishment of the temple will set the stage for end-time events. During Donald Trump's presidency, his decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the U.S. embassy there was met with enthusiasm by many evangelicals. They perceived this action as aligning with biblical prophecy and potentially paving the way for the Third Temple's construction. However, it's important to note that the Temple Mount, the proposed site for the Third Temple, currently houses the Dome of the Rock, an Islamic shrine of great significance. Any efforts to alter this status quo are highly sensitive and could lead to significant geopolitical tensions. While the idea of rebuilding the Third Temple is a significant aspect of certain religious beliefs, its realization involves complex religious, political, and cultural considerations. There are forces at work to obtain this goal. The situation is getting dangerous. Why does the Israeli army attack the Al-Aqsa mosque? This is supposed to be one of the holiest sites in the world. In one of the holiest cities in the world. But cell phone footage, shot inside the Al-Aqsa mosque in Jerusalem, shows a scene that's anything but tranquil. Trapped inside, Palestinian worshippers are tear-gassed by Israeli forces. You can see the stained glass windows of the prayer hall being smashed by the police, who then aim their guns through the openings. Eventually, they enter the hall and begin arresting dozens of people. This scene has been repeated over and over. Israeli police raiding the compound, locking the mosque's doors, attacking with tear gas, rubber bullets, beatings and arrests. In the ancient courtyard, people fight back with stones and fireworks. This is a city under occupation, where Israelis have the ultimate power, and they often succeed in clearing the compound to let these Jewish Israelis in. On the surface, this might seem like just a religious rivalry, but there's a lot more to this story. It's about control, not just of the holy sites, but of the land and the people who live on it. So we're going to look at who these people are, what their goals are, and how a 1994 massacre of Palestinians at another holy site by an Israeli-American settler might shed light on where Jerusalem is headed today. Israel is trying to make Jerusalem Jewish. Jerusalem is at the heart of three religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity. But since occupying East Jerusalem in 1967, Israel has aimed to ensure the city has a Jewish majority. You are stealing my house. And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it. To Palestinians who have been living under occupation and denied equality for decades, Al-Aqsa isn't just Islam's third holiest site. It's a symbol of their nationhood. Jews call Al-Aqsa the Temple Mount because it's believed to be the site where two ancient Jewish temples once stood. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans, roughly 2,000 years ago. But until then, it had been the center of Jewish worship, the holiest place for Jews. Still, even after they occupied the site in 1967, Israeli authorities maintained a policy that Jews should not pray there and that only Muslims can. But that might be changing. What do Israel's doomsday ultra-nationalists want? These people are driving that. They belong to various groups that make up what's generally referred to as the Temple Mount movement. Their ultimate goal is to demolish the mosque, this symbol of Palestinian nationhood, this sacred site to Muslims worldwide, and build a third Jewish temple there. And they're pretty open about their plans. For 34 years, the Temple Institute has been preparing for the rebuilding of the Holy Temple and the renewal of the Divine Service. They've even got detailed architectural renderings of what the temple would look like. They receive financial support from the Israeli government and charities in the US, Canada and the UK. In recent years, they've even offered cash rewards to Jews who enter the Al-Aqsa compound or slaughter animals there, which was part of Jewish ritual at the original temple. For decades, these activists were dismissed by most Israelis and constrained by the government. But that was then. So a few years ago, this was considered fringe, zealots, lunatics, peculiar. Today it's mainstream. Yehuda Glick is one of the movement's most prominent figures, and he served in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. He's not the only one to reach that office. 10 years ago, there was not a single member of the Knesset who ascended Temple Mount. Today, we have 20 Knesset members. It's become common for government ministers and leaders and even the Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, to talk about imposing Jewish prayers at Al-Aqsa. Until the early 2000s, the number of Israeli Jews who entered the Al-Aqsa compound was very small. Maybe a few dozen a year. But as the Temple Mount movement has moved into the mainstream, that number has recently grown to tens of thousands a year. A mass shooter changed Hebron forever, with the Israeli government increasingly allowing the status quo at Al-Aqsa to change. The worry is that things are going in one direction, towards a situation where Palestinian access to it is restricted even more. The way it has been at another holy site in the wake of a bloody mass killing. Here's that story. 20 miles south of Jerusalem is the Israeli-occupied city of Hebron, where the prophet Abraham is believed to be buried with members of his family under this building. Abraham is a central figure for both Jews and Muslims. That's why Jews call this site the Cave of the Patriarchs and Muslims refer to it as the Ibrahimi Mosque. After the occupation began in 1967, Hebron was the first place that Israelis settled in. In violation of international law, Jews and Muslims both prayed at the site. But the situation was volatile. On the morning of February 25, 1994, hundreds of Palestinian Muslims were praying at the Ibrahimi Mosque. An American-born Israeli settler, a reservist in the Israeli army carrying an automatic rifle, entered the mosque, waited for worshippers to kneel down in prayer, and then started shooting. Baruch Goldstein killed 29 people and injured more than 120. One witness described how there were bodies and blood everywhere. Goldstein's massacre ended when the survivors hit him with a fire extinguisher and beat him to death. The injured were rushed to hospitals, which were overwhelmed. And as news of the killing spread, protests broke out across Hebron. Israeli soldiers opened fire, killing more than 20 additional Palestinians in the following days. While researching this story, they came across a letter published in the New York Times in 1981. The author notes the difference between Palestinian and Israeli birth rates. The solution, he writes, is for Israel to, quote, act decisively to remove the Arab minority from within its borders. The letter was written by Baruch Goldstein 2 years before he left the United States for Israel. Goldstein joined the Israeli military and became an army doctor, but often refused to treat non-Jews. He joined an anti-Arab political party called Kash that was later banned for inciting racism. He lived and was eventually buried in Kiryat Arba, an illegal Israeli settlement in Hebron. The settlers there strongly believed that Hebron should be theirs alone. After the massacre, the settlement's chief rabbi described Goldstein as Goldstein's grave is often visited by supporters and his tombstone reads, "He gave his life for the people of Israel, its Torah and land." The massacre led to big changes in Hebron at the expense of its victims. The Palestinians, under the pretext of securing the settlers who lived in the old city and preventing more violence, the Israeli army imposed a 2-week curfew on all of Hebron's Palestinians. It made the area around the Ibrahimi Mosque permanently off-limits to everyone except settlers and foreign tourists. This had been a bustling marketplace, a commercial center for Palestinian life. But after the massacre, these shop fronts were welded shut by the Israeli army. The old city is now cut off from the rest of Hebron by dozens of Israeli checkpoints, making it very difficult for most Palestinians to get there or pray at the mosque. Israel also forcibly divided the Ibrahimi Mosque, 40% for Muslims and 60% for Jews. But all of it under full Israeli military control. Basically, the settlers won. And here's how that story is connected to today. Palestinians fear that what happened in Hebron in 1994 could be repeated in Jerusalem. It's not just about the possibility of another massacre, but the fact that the people who share Baruch Goldstein's beliefs have more power than ever in Israel. For example, the banned political party Goldstein was part of has rebranded. Some of its former members joined new parties and are now in the Israeli Knesset. They're drafting and passing laws and are part of the ruling coalition government. Take the Otzma Yehudit party. For instance, its platform explicitly calls for Palestinians to leave. It also calls for Israeli sovereignty and ownership to be imposed over the Temple Mount. And its leader had a photograph of Baruch Goldstein hanging on his living room wall. For Palestinians, that's a call to cut him off from Jerusalem. Will Jerusalem be segregated? Most of the world's governments, including Israel's biggest backer, the United States, have insisted for decades that a peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians would include a formula for dividing or sharing Jerusalem. But as the Israeli government moves steadily in the opposite direction, the US hasn't pushed back. Instead, it's done things that Israel believes strengthen its claims over the entire city. Like moving the US embassy into Jerusalem. But if nothing is done to stop this trend, the consequences might be felt far beyond the Holy Land. This situation indeed reveals increasing tensions and risks around the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Here's a breakdown of how escalating efforts to assert control over this area might drive not only regional but potentially global conflict. Escalation of religious and political tensions. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, located on the Temple Mount, is one of Islam's holiest sites. Moves by some groups in Israel to assert control over this site, with the aim of building a third temple, are not only religiously symbolic but also deeply inflammatory for Palestinians and Muslims worldwide. These actions represent an assault on their religious heritage and national identity, potentially turning religious rivalry into a flashpoint for greater unrest. Increased militarization and use of force. As shown in the incidents described, Israeli forces have employed tear gas, rubber bullets, and arrests to disperse Palestinian worshippers and assert control over the Al-Aqsa compound. This intensification of force in such a sacred place can easily provoke violent backlash, both locally and from sympathizers across the Middle East and beyond, leading to cycles of retaliation that might escalate into broader military conflict. The rise of ultra-nationalist movements. The presence of ultra-nationalist movements in Israel, some with roots in previously banned extremist groups, increases the likelihood of radical actions aimed at permanently changing the status quo on the Temple Mount. If mainstream political support grows for these ultra-nationalist agendas, there could be greater risks of policies or actions that provoke conflict, especially if these groups seek to restrict or ban Palestinian access to holy sites. Potential for civil unrest and terrorist retaliation. Actions perceived as infringing on Muslim access to Al-Aqsa could lead to mass protests, civil unrest, or even acts of terrorism, both within Israel and abroad. This site has historically been a flashpoint for conflict, and any move that intensifies control over it could provoke violent responses, potentially sparking intifadas, uprisings, or attacks by extremist groups who see the preservation of Al-Aqsa as a call to action. threat to regional stability and broader alliances. The situation on the Temple Mount has the potential to affect regional alliances and stability, as many Muslim-majority nations view any Israeli control over Al-Aqsa as an unacceptable violation. Countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and others have a vested interest in supporting Palestinian claims to the site. If tensions escalate, these nations could respond politically or even militarily, which might broaden the conflict. Impact on U.S. Middle East relations. U.S. policy has generally backed Israel, but a significant escalation around the Temple Mount could test this support, especially given the site's importance to Muslims worldwide. If the U.S. is seen as enabling Israeli moves that alter the status quo, it risks alienating allies in the Muslim world, damaging diplomatic relations, and potentially inviting backlash against American interests in the region. Potential for internationalized conflict. Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount hold unique significance for multiple religions, making any conflict over this area highly likely to resonate globally. Movements within Israel to assert greater control over the site, backed by some evangelical Christians who see a third temple as part of biblical prophecy, could add an international dimension to the conflict. A global religious conflict could emerge, involving actors from different faiths who feel compelled to intervene. Risk of major war with global involvement. If attempts to change control over Al-Aqsa lead to full-scale conflict between Israel and neighboring states or provoke sustained attacks by transnational groups, the conflict could expand quickly. Given the religious, cultural, and political sensitivities surrounding the Temple Mount, even a localized clash could spiral into a larger war that pulls in major global powers with interests in the region. The current situation at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount reflects a dangerous trajectory where religious and nationalist goals are pushing toward a confrontation with potentially far-reaching consequences. If the push to alter the status quo continues, it could spark local and international conflict, with impacts on global stability, alliances, and religious communities worldwide. Addressing this issue will require diplomatic efforts that respect the rights and religious significance of all parties involved, alongside urgent measures to prevent further escalation. How many times do you find mentions of this dangerous situation by so-called mainstream media? If you want to search back 10 years, that's okay, because that's how long I have been bitching about this. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem has been a focal point of tension and conflict between Israelis and Palestinians for many years. Mainstream media outlets have reported on various incidents involving the mosque, especially during periods of heightened unrest. Key incidents and media coverage. April 2023 clashes. In April 2023, Israeli police raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque, leading to violent confrontations with Palestinian worshippers. This incident was widely covered by international media, including the BBC, which reported on the violence and its implications. Rocket attacks following clashes. Following the April 2023 clashes, Palestinian militant groups launched rocket attacks into Israel from Gaza and Lebanon. Actions broadly construed as a response to the events at Al-Aqsa. This escalation was documented in various news outlets, highlighting the broader regional impact of the mosque-related tensions. As of November 2024, there have been reports of Israeli settlers storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Israeli forces invading neighborhoods in Jerusalem. These events have been covered by media organizations such as the International Middle East Media Center. Over the past decade, Mainstream media have intermittently reported on incidents involving the Al-Aqsa Mosque, particularly during significant escalations. However, the frequency and depth of coverage can vary based on the incident's severity and the broader geopolitical context. While major events receive widespread attention, smaller or less violent incidents may not be as prominently featured. The Al-Aqsa Mosque remains a sensitive and volatile site, with incidents there often leading to broader regional tensions. Mainstream media have documented various events over the years, reflecting the ongoing complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But they don't mention the motive behind it. While mainstream media often cover incidents at Al-Aqsa Mosque and the surrounding tensions, they rarely delve into the deeper motivations, particularly the religious and ideological factors driving actions on both sides. The coverage tends to focus on immediate events, the clashes, protests, arrests, and ensuing violence, without examining the underlying goals, especially those linked to end times beliefs, the push for a third temple, or the vision of some ultra-nationalist groups to change the Temple Mount's status. Key motivations often overlooked by mainstream media: the Temple Mount movement and the Third Temple. Some groups in Israel, such as the Temple Mount movement, are motivated by the belief that the Al-Aqsa Mosque should be replaced with a third Jewish temple. This movement, which was once considered fringe, has become more mainstream, with political figures openly supporting it. Yet, mainstream media rarely discuss how these ideological motivations underpin some of the actions and policies affecting the Temple Mount. Apocalyptic beliefs and evangelical support. Among some evangelical Christians, there's an end times interpretation tied to the construction of a third temple, which they believe would fulfill biblical prophecy. This connection between evangelical support for Israeli policies and end times ideology is rarely explored. Despite its influence on U.S. foreign policy and support for actions around Jerusalem, ultra-nationalist goals to redefine sovereignty over the Temple Mount, ultra-nationalist political parties in Israel, which have gained more influence in recent years, advocate for greater Jewish sovereignty over the Temple Mount. These groups see control over the site as central to their vision of a Jewish state, a perspective that often aligns with policies limiting Palestinian access to Al-Aqsa. This nationalist dimension, while covered superficially, is seldom analyzed in depth regarding its impact on long-term regional stability. The vision of ethno-religious homogeneity. For some ultra-nationalists, the ultimate aim is not just control over specific holy sites, but an Israel that is exclusively Jewish. The motivation behind changing access to or even the existence of Al-Aqsa on the Temple Mount is tied to a broader vision of a Jewish Jerusalem, and often, an ethno-religious state. This motivation is rarely explored, though it's essential to understanding why changes to the status quo at the mosque are so contested. Why this lack of coverage matters. Without a full examination of these underlying motives, media coverage can give an incomplete and skewed picture of events. It often appears as if clashes are isolated events or merely responses to individual provocations, without recognizing the long-term goals that make these incidents part of a broader strategy. This lack of context can undermine understanding of the conflict's complexity, without understanding the ideological and religious motives. Audiences may not grasp why the Temple Mount remains such a volatile issue. The situation is far more than a series of isolated incidents. It is part of an ongoing effort by certain groups to fulfill their vision, which is at odds with that of others in the region. limit global awareness and accountability, if the media fails to highlight the motives behind actions at Al-Aqsa. It's more difficult to hold groups and governments accountable for policies that might incite or perpetuate violence. Public awareness of these motives could put pressure on leaders and organizations to address the root causes, rather than only responding to periodic escalations. Ignore the risk of escalation. The media's failure to highlight the motivations of religious and nationalist groups could prevent international actors from understanding the potential for escalation. Recognizing these goals reveals the likelihood of more intense future conflicts if these groups move closer to realizing their aims. What in-depth coverage could include? To provide a more complete picture, media outlets would benefit from investigating and reporting on the end times beliefs that motivate some evangelical and ultra-nationalist support for policies impacting the Temple Mount, the broader ideological goals of the Temple Mount movement and its growing mainstream influence, the implications of increased ultra-nationalist political power in Israel for Palestinians' rights and access to religious sites, the motives behind actions at Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount are deeply rooted in ideology, nationalism, and prophecy, which mainstream media rarely emphasize. Without this context, the public is left with an incomplete understanding of the conflict, which is essential for meaningful international engagement and peace efforts. In my opinion, not reporting the motives is a trumpet calling out, "Why not?" We mentioned a lot of why nots, but we common people never hear it from the news desk. When mainstream media fail to report on the ideological, religious, and political motives behind actions at places like the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it leaves a significant gap in public understanding. Without context, coverage of these events can feel shallow, making it difficult for people to understand why certain actions are taking place or to recognize the potential consequences. This omission might indeed signal a silent invitation to ask, "Why not?" And that leaves room for harmful narratives to gain traction unchallenged. Why lack of motive reporting is a problem creates a sense of normalization. By focusing only on the immediate events without exploring motives, news reports can give the impression that these incidents are normal or routine rather than part of a larger strategy. When critical motives are left out, the public doesn't get the full picture and may underestimate the risks involved or the intensity of beliefs driving certain actions. Limits public accountability. When the media fail to report on the ideological underpinnings, they limit the public's ability to hold accountable those who are pushing these narratives. Without knowledge of the larger motives, it's hard for common people to demand accountability from leaders or institutions, as they may not even realize the broader implications of what's being done. Encourages misunderstanding and apathy. If people don't understand the why behind these events, they may become desensitized to the conflict or misunderstand it as merely a series of violent episodes. This can lead to apathy, where people tune out rather than engaging critically, especially in situations that seem distant or complex. Missing the motives takes away the human and ideological dimensions, reducing the conflict to a series of superficial headlines, paves the way for extremist narratives. When the motives aren't covered, it can leave room for extremist or conspiratorial narratives to fill the void, often in dangerous ways. Groups with ideological agendas can exploit this gap, framing events to serve their own ends, often pushing a divisive or hostile interpretation, without a clear, factual narrative from mainstream sources. People are left to fill in the gaps themselves, which can contribute to misinformation. silences critical questions. People may not even know the right questions to ask. If the motives and larger ambitions, like constructing the Third Temple or reshaping the Temple Mount's status, aren't discussed openly, then citizens can't question or challenge these developments. This limits public dialogue and inquiry, which are essential for democratic accountability and meaningful change. Why it's essential to bring motives to the news desk. To bridge this gap, mainstream media need to go beyond event reporting and start presenting the full picture, including the ideological and religious motives that fuel the ongoing situation. Clear reporting on these motivations would empower citizens. People could engage more meaningfully with the issues, question leaders, and advocate for policies based on a full understanding of the stakes. Encourage responsible leadership. Public awareness puts pressure on leaders and organizations to take responsible actions, rather than allowing hidden agendas to dictate policy. Build empathy and understanding. Reporting on the motives brings the human dimension into the story, highlighting the impact of these ideologies on people's lives and making it easier to see the conflict's complexities. Create an informed public dialogue. Open reporting on the motivations encourages honest dialogue and critical thinking, helping to foster a society that's more resilient to extremism and better equipped to work toward solutions. Failing to report on these motives is more than a missed opportunity. It actively limits public understanding and engagement. It's crucial for mainstream media to address this gap, providing common people with the context they need to fully understand what's at stake. Reporting motives openly would offer a more accurate view of the conflict, giving everyone a clearer why, and helping to prevent a silent invitation to escalate dangerous agendas. Let's outline the imminent threat posed by the situation at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount. This covers the overlooked motivations, ideological drivers, potential risks, and the role of media in shaping public awareness. This explores the growing threat of conflict surrounding the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Temple Mount, highlighting how underlying religious and ideological motivations contribute to escalating tensions. Despite frequent coverage of violent incidents at these sites, mainstream media seldom address the motives driving these conflicts, leaving a gap in public understanding. By examining the goals of various ultra-nationalist, evangelical, and Temple Mount movement groups, we underscore the need for transparent media reporting to foster awareness, public accountability, and informed dialogue. Understanding these motives is essential to addressing the threat and mitigating the risks of regional and global escalation. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and Temple Mount are central to the religious and cultural identities of Muslims, Jews, and Christians worldwide. In recent years, a dangerous escalation has taken place at this site, with frequent violent clashes, increased nationalist rhetoric, and intensified religious ambitions. Although mainstream media report on isolated incidents at Al-Aqsa, they frequently omit the deeper ideological and religious motives that fuel this conflict. Failing to address these motives contributes to misunderstandings, apathy, and the potential for extremist narratives to fill the void. By exploring the ideological drivers, potential consequences, and media's role, we can emphasize the need for more comprehensive coverage and public engagement to address this escalating threat. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount hold profound significance for Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike. For Muslims, Al-Aqsa is Islam's third holiest site, a symbol of Palestinian identity and nationhood. For Jews, The Temple Mount represents the holiest site, historically housing the first and second temples. For some Christians, particularly evangelicals, the site is seen as part of a prophetic path toward the end times. Understanding the spiritual, cultural, and national symbolism of this location is crucial to comprehending why actions taken here are deeply inflammatory and have the potential to ignite large-scale conflict. Despite frequent incidents of violence, media coverage often fails to delve into the motivations behind these clashes. A closer look reveals that several groups with distinct ideological and religious agendas are fueling this conflict. The Temple Mount movement and the push for a third temple. Certain groups within Israel's Temple Mount movement seek to demolish the Al-Aqsa mosque to rebuild a third Jewish temple. Once considered a fringe belief, this movement has gained traction and significant political support. These groups believe that reclaiming the Temple Mount fulfills a divine mandate and is central to their religious mission. The media rarely address how the Temple Mount movement's goals have become mainstream. Even within political circles, evangelical Christian support and end times prophecies. Evangelical Christians, particularly in the United States, often support Israeli policies on the Temple Mount due to beliefs that constructing a third temple aligns with biblical prophecy and will usher in the second coming of Jesus. This support has influenced U.S. foreign policy and strengthened ideological movements within Israel. However, this evangelical influence and its implications for the site's future are often neglected by mainstream media. Ultra-nationalist ideologies and the vision of a Jewish-only Jerusalem. Ultra-nationalist factions in Israel envision a Jewish-only Jerusalem and advocate for exclusive Jewish sovereignty over the Temple Mount. For them, changing the site's access policies or even restricting Muslim worship are steps toward fulfilling their nationalist vision. By failing to report on these ideologies, media coverage often misses the broader vision of ethno-religious homogeneity driving changes to the site's status. Ethnic and religious control as an underlying agenda. The conflict is not only about religious sites, but also about control over Jerusalem itself. The push to assert Jewish control over the Temple Mount is linked to a broader agenda to create a Jewish-majority Jerusalem. This vision disregards Palestinian claims and rights and has led to policies that restrict Palestinian access to sacred sites, further fueling resentment and resistance. The role of media, a silent, why not? The lack of coverage on these motives creates a gap in public understanding, raising unspoken questions about why this conflict exists. By failing to address the why behind events, mainstream media coverage inadvertently signals a why not to the public, normalizing violence and allowing extremist interpretations to go unchallenged. This omission has several critical consequences. Normalizing conflict and creating apathy. Without examining motivations, reports on Al-Aqsa clashes may feel like routine violence, creating a sense of inevitability or desensitization among the public. The normalization of these incidents risks fostering apathy, limiting public accountability, and reducing the sense of urgency needed to address the root causes. Encouraging extremist narratives and misinformation. The absence of motive reporting leaves a void that extremist narratives and misinformation can easily fill. Groups with vested interests can frame events in divisive, hostile terms, exploiting public ignorance and polarizing audiences. Comprehensive reporting could mitigate this by providing factual, context-rich narratives, limiting public accountability and meaningful dialogue. when the ideological drivers are left out of coverage. The public cannot hold accountable those who push for dangerous policies or actions. This silence hinders critical public dialogue on how best to handle the Temple Mount's complex status and limits citizens' ability to question leaders' motives and policies. Potential consequences of ignoring the imminent threat. The omission of motives has tangible consequences that could increase the likelihood of widespread conflict. Escalation into regional and global conflict. Actions on the Temple Mount have historically triggered violent responses not only from Palestinians, but also from Muslim-majority countries. If extremist actions escalate, they could prompt a broader regional war, with states like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran compelled to respond. Global powers with stakes in the region, such as the US, Russia, and China, may be drawn in, increasing the risk of international conflict. Rise of ultra-nationalism and extremism. Growing support for ultra-nationalist policies in Israel risks creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of intensified violence. If policies aimed at removing or restricting Palestinians and other Muslim groups advance, it could provoke widespread resistance, reinforcing ultra-nationalist narratives that justify further violence. Potential for global religious conflict. Al-Aqsa's significance to multiple faiths means that conflict there could resonate worldwide, potentially inciting extremist responses across borders. The belief among some Christians and Jews that the site is part of an apocalyptic prophecy only heightens this risk, as groups may feel compelled to intervene or support escalatory actions. The need for transparent, comprehensive coverage. The conflict at Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount is not merely about religious differences. It involves complex ideologies with profound consequences for regional and global stability. Media's failure to report on these motives leaves the public uninformed, perpetuates apathy, and allows dangerous ideologies to remain unchecked. Transparent reporting on the motives and ideologies driving actions at Al-Aqsa is essential to foster public accountability, mitigate the spread of misinformation, and encourage a deeper understanding of the risks involved. By addressing the motives behind this imminent threat, media can help create an informed, engaged public capable of advocating for peaceful solutions in one of the world's most volatile regions. Recommendations for future coverage and action. Comprehensive reporting on motivations and ideologies. Mainstream media should investigate and report on the ideological, religious, and political motives behind actions at Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount. This would provide a complete picture of the conflict and empower public awareness. Encouraging international dialogue on religious and cultural protections. Diplomatic and interfaith efforts should focus on creating frameworks for shared access and protection of sacred sites. Promoting mutual respect for diverse religious claims can prevent unilateral actions and preserve stability. Building public awareness on risks of extremism and ultra-nationalism. Media, educational institutions, and NGOs should work to inform the public about the potential consequences of ultra-nationalist and extremist ideologies. Increased awareness can help prevent escalation and promote tolerance. This underscores the urgent need for mainstream media to cover the deeper motives behind the ongoing conflict at Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount. By recognizing the ideological forces at work, we can address the real risks, foster public accountability, and work toward a future of mutual respect and stability.